the quiet hours before dawn, when the world still holds its breath between darkness and light, Amara knelt by the grinding stone outside her stepmother's compound, her hands working the cassava into powder with a rhythm born from years of survival. She was 19 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived several lifetimes, each one harder than the last. The red earth beneath her knees was the same earth that had swallowed her mother 7 years ago, the same earth that seemed determined to swallow her too, slowly, mercilessly, one humiliation at a time. But Amara still sang, softly, almost as a whisper to herself. She sang the old songs her mother had taught her, the melodies that spoke of better days and promised lands that seemed to exist only in the realm of memory and longing. The village of Umuigs was waking around her, roosters crowing their territorial claims, children crying for their mothers, generators sputtering to life with their familiar mechanical coughs. This was her world, small and suffocating, but it was all she knew. What Amara did not know, could not have known, as she ground that cassava and sang those songs, was that this morning, this ordinary, unremarkable morning, would be the last morning of her old life. That within 48 hours she would find herself drugged, trapped, and staring down the barrel of a fate worse than death itself. And that a man she had never met, a billionaire with his own ghosts and his own reasons, would crash into her nightmare like thunder, breaking through a storm, changing everything she thought she understood about power, about justice, and about what it means to truly save someone. Mama and Kechi stumbled out of the house just as the first rays of sun began to bleed across the horizon, her wrapper tied carelessly around her waist, her eyes red and swollen from another sleepless night spent gambling away money she didn't have at the local betting shop. She had been beautiful once. Amara's father had fallen for that beauty, had married her 2 years after Amara's mother died, hoping to give his daughter a maternal figure, hoping to fill the void that death had carved into their home. But grief and greed have a way of rotting people from the inside out, and Mama and Kechi had rotted spectacularly. The gambling had started small, just a few naira here and there, but addiction never stays small. It grows like a cancer, consuming everything: dignity, morality, family bonds. Now she owed Chief Okonkwo 800,000 naira, a sum so astronomical it might as well have been 8 million. The debt had accumulated over 2 years of borrowed money, false promises, and compounding interest that only a man like Chief Okonkwo would charge. He wasn't just a creditor, he was a predator who used debt as a noose, tightening it slowly around the necks of desperate people until they had no choice but to give him whatever he wanted. And what Chief Okonkwo wanted, what he had wanted for the past year, with an obsession that made the village women whisper and shake their heads, was Amara. "You're wasting kerosene," Mama and Kechi shrieked, her voice like broken glass scraping against concrete. "Do you think we're made of money? Do you think your precious singing pays for anything in this house?" Amara kept her head down, kept grinding, kept singing inside her mind, where Mama and Kechi's poison couldn't reach. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse, that silence was sometimes the only weapon available to the powerless. The village market was alive with the chaos of commerce and gossip when Amara arrived later that morning, a basin of tomatoes balanced perfectly on her head, her bare feet navigating the muddy paths with practiced ease. The market was the beating heart of Umuez, where goods and information exchanged hands with equal fervor, where reputations were built and destroyed between the yam stalls and the fabric vendors. The old women sat in clusters, their voices carrying across the crowded space like radio broadcasts. And today, as always, They were talking about Chief Okonkwo. That man's eyes follow that girl like a hawk circling a lamb, Mama Adeyezi said, her voice loud enough for half the market to hear. Every time she passes his compound, he's there, watching from his veranda. It's not natural. A man of 72 should be thinking about his grave, not about fresh meat. The other women clucked their tongues in agreement, but their disapproval was performative, theatrical. Everyone knew what Chief Okonkwo was. Everyone knew about the 3 wives who lived in his mansion, like decorative prisoners, about the young girls from poor families who had mysteriously become his wives over the years, about the way traditional authority and money could make almost anything acceptable, almost anything legal. Amara sold her tomatoes quickly, avoiding eye contact with the gossiping women, trying to make herself invisible. But invisibility is a privilege not afforded to beautiful girls in small villages. Her beauty was not the polished, cosmopolitan beauty of city women. It was something rawer, more honest. High cheekbones that caught the light, eyes that seemed to hold entire universes of unspoken pain, a grace in her movements that no amount of poverty could diminish. She was a target, and she didn't even fully understand it yet. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, like palm oil spreading across water, a black Mercedes-Benz pulled up to Mama Nkechi's compound, kicking up clouds of red dust that settled on everything like a prophecy of what was coming. Chief Okonkwo emerged slowly, deliberately, flanked by 2 village elders who served as his perpetual validators, the men who gave his predatory behavior the veneer of tradition and respectability. He was a grotesque figure, his belly preceding him like a declaration of excess, his skin loose and gray, his eyes sharp and calculating despite his age. He wore traditional attire, a rich burgundy agbada with gold embroidery, and carried a walking stick, not because he needed it, but because it was a symbol of authority, of power, of the patriarchal order that had protected men like him for generations. Mama Nkechi practically threw herself at his feet, her desperation palpable in every gesture, every word. They sat in the small parlor that still held photographs of Amara's father, a good man who would have burned this house down before allowing what was about to be proposed. Chief Okonkwo didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I am prepared to forgive the entire debt," he said, his voice like gravel being crushed underfoot. 800,000 naira, gone. Plus, I will give an additional 200,000 for the bride price. But you know my condition. Mama Nkechi nodded so vigorously, her headscarf nearly slipped off. "Amara will be honored to become your wife, Chief. It is our tradition. She will understand." But Amara, standing in the doorway where they hadn't noticed her, understood perfectly. She understood that she was being sold like livestock, that her stepmother had finally found a buyer for the burden she had always considered her to be. "I would rather die hungry than live in a cage made of gold," Amara said, her voice quiet but unshakable, and the room fell into a silence so thick it could have been cut with a machete. The beating came that night, swift and brutal. Mama Nkechi's rage unleashed like a storm that had been building for years. The belt came down across Amara's back, her arms, her legs, each strike punctuated by screaming accusations. "You ungrateful witch, you selfish child. Do you know what they will do to us when they come to collect? Do you know what happens to people who cannot pay their debts to Chief Okonkwo? They take the land. They take the house. They take everything, and we will be begging in the streets, and it will be because of your foolish pride." But beneath the rage was something else, something that sounded almost like pleading, like Mama Nkechi was trying to convince herself, as much as Amara, that this betrayal was necessary. that survival sometimes required the sacrifice of innocence, that the world was cruel, and they were only playing by its rules. Amara took the beating in silence, her body curling inward like a flower closing against the night, her mind retreating to that internal sanctuary where her mother's voice still lived, where songs still had power, where she could still be a child who believed in goodness. When it was over, when Mama Nkechi had exhausted herself and stumbled back to her room, Amara lay on the floor of her small corner, counting her breaths, counting her heartbeats, counting the reasons she had to keep living. The list was getting shorter. That night, through the thin walls, Amara heard the phone call that would seal her fate. Mama Nkechi's voice, low and conspiratorial. "Give me 2 days. I will. Prepare her. She will be compliant. You have my word." And then, more chilling than anything else, "Yes, I have the sedative. She won't remember a thing." The next morning arrived wrapped in an unsettling sweetness that made Amara's skin crawl with instinctive dread. Mama Nkechi was transformed, smiling, gentle, her voice dripping with maternal affection that she had never shown before. "I made your favorite," she said, presenting a steaming plate of jollof rice with fried plantains, the kind of meal that was usually reserved for celebrations or important guests, not for stepdaughters who were usually given leftover gari and soup. "Eat, my daughter. I was wrong to be harsh yesterday. You know I love you, don't you? Everything I do is to protect us both." The manipulation was so transparent, it would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. But Amara was hungry, not just for food, but for affection, for any scrap of maternal love that might fill the void her real mother had left behind. So she ate. She ate even as warning bells rang in the back of her mind, even as her instincts screamed at her to run, because the human heart is a foolish thing that wants to believe in redemption, even when all evidence points to betrayal. The drug worked quickly, efficiently. Within 20 minutes, the room began to tilt and spin, like the world had been knocked off its axis. Amara tried to stand, tried to call for help, but her legs folded beneath her like paper, and the last thing she heard before darkness swallowed her whole was Mama Nkechi's voice, cold and businesslike, now that the performance was over. "Forgive me, child, but we both must survive, and I have chosen myself." When Amara woke, she was no longer in her stepmother's compound. She was in a bedroom that looked like it had been designed by someone who confused luxury with imprisonment. Heavy brocade curtains blocking out the sun, ornate furniture that seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room, and the unmistakable smell of old money and older sins. She was wearing a white ceremonial wrapper that she had never seen before. Her body felt heavy and disconnected, and the door, when she stumbled toward it, was locked from the outside. Chief Okonkwo entered the room like he owned it, which he did, and like he owned her, which he believed he did. He had bathed in expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the smell of palm wine and entitlement that emanated from his pores, and his eyes traveled over Amara's body with the casual assessment of someone examining a purchase. "You gave me quite a scare yesterday, with all that dramatic talk of dying," he said, his voice attempting joviality, but landing somewhere closer to menace. "But Mama Nkechi assured me you were just being emotional. Women are emotional creatures. My other wives were resistant at first too, but they learned. You will learn." He moved toward her slowly, confidently, a man who had never been denied anything in his 72 years of existence. A man who believed that money and tradition gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. But Amara, even drugged, even terrified, even trapped, was still her mother's daughter. And her mother had been a woman who once told her that death with dignity was preferable to life without it. The glass figurine on the dresser, some expensive, meaningless ornament, shattered beautifully when Amara smashed it against the edge of the furniture. She held the largest shard to her own throat, her hand trembling, but her eyes steady, and said words that would echo in Chief Okonkwo's mind for the rest of his miserable life. "If you take one more step toward me, you will marry a corpse, and I promise you, Chief, I am not bluffing. I have nothing left to lose, except my soul, and I will die before I let you have that." For the first time in decades, Chief Okonkwo felt something he had forgotten existed: fear. Not fear of consequences or social judgment, but primal fear of a human being who had reached the edge of their endurance and was fully prepared to jump. He backed toward the door, his face contorting between rage and shock. "You're hysterical. The drug hasn't worn off. We'll continue this conversation tomorrow, when you're thinking clearly." He locked her in and left, and Amara collapsed against the wall, the glass shard still in her hand, and finally allowed herself to cry. Across the village, in a world that might as well have existed on a different planet, Chibueze sat in a community meeting hall, listening to village elders discuss infrastructure needs and investment opportunities with the kind of performative enthusiasm that comes from people who have learned to beg elegantly. He was 34 years old, but his eyes carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had built an empire from nothing and learned that money could buy almost everything except peace. He had left Nigeria at 19 with nothing but ambition and anger, had built a technology company in Lagos that now operated across 12 African countries, and had returned to invest in rural communities, not out of charity, but out of something more complicated. Guilt, perhaps, or the ghost of a sister who haunted him still. Adithbiz. Her name was Adeos, and she had been 16 when their impoverished family had married her off to a wealthy old man to clear debts. She had died in childbirth at 17, carrying a baby she had never wanted, trapped in a marriage that had killed her spirit long before it killed her body. Chibueze had been powerless to stop it then, had been a boy himself, but he had made a promise over her grave that he would spend the rest of his life making sure no other girl suffered the same fate. Obioma, his assistant and childhood friend, leaned in during a break in the meeting. "There are rumors," she whispered, "about Chief Okonkwo, about a girl." Chibueze's jaw tightened. What kind of rumors? The kind that sound like a Daisy's story. Debt trap, forced marriage, a girl who doesn't want to be there. The housemaids are talking. Something cold and sharp settled in Chibueze's chest, the old rage that he had learned to channel into productivity, but never fully extinguished. "Find out everything. I want names, locations, details, and I want it within the hour." What Obioma discovered in the next 60 minutes was enough to make even her, a woman who had seen the worst of what poverty and power dynamics could create, feel physically ill. She bribed a housemaid with money that was probably more than the woman earned in 6 months, and the story came pouring out like poison from a wound. The drugging orchestrated by the stepmother. The debt trap, carefully constructed by Chief Okonkwo over 2 years. The locked room, the white ceremonial wrapper. The girl who had held glass to her own throat rather than submit. The housemaid even provided photographs, taken secretly through a window. Blurry images of Amara, her eyes vacant with drugs, her body positioned like a doll awaiting its owner. When Obioma showed Chibueze the evidence, his face became a mask of controlled fury that she had only seen a handful of times before, each time preceding decisive, sometimes ruthless action. "We're not calling the police," he said quietly, and Obioma nodded because she understood why. In villages like this, Chief Okonkwo owned the police the same way he owned the elders, the same way he thought he owned Amara. What are we doing then? We're getting her out. Tonight. Right now. He stood, already moving toward the door. Call Emeka and Chidi. Tell them to meet us at the car with a security detail. And Obioma? He turned back to her, and his eyes held something that looked like both grief and determination. If anyone tries to stop us, I don't care who they are or what title they hold. She's leaving that house tonight, even if I have to carry her out myself. They arrived at Chief Okonkwo's mansion. At dawn, when the world was caught between the darkness of night and the promise of morning, that liminal space where anything seems possible. Chibueze didn't announce himself, didn't ask permission, didn't engage in the elaborate protocols of respect that men like Chief Okonkwo expected. He simply walked through the compound gates with the confidence of someone who had learned that true power doesn't ask. It declares. The security guards, shocked by the audacity and recognizing the kind of wealth that eclipsed even their bosses, stepped aside. Chibueze moved through the mansion like a man on a mission from God himself, Obioma and 2 security men following in his wake, checking rooms with systematic efficiency. When they found the locked bedroom door, Chibueze didn't bother searching for a key. He took 3 steps back and kicked it open with a violence that made the entire doorframe splinter and crack. And there she was, Amara, sitting on the floor in the corner, still holding that glass shard, her eyes wide with terror and confusion, looking at this stranger who had just broken down her prison door like some kind of avenging angel. "You're safe now," Chibueze said, his voice gentler than Obioma had ever heard it, and he held out his hand to Amara like an offering, not a demand. "No one will touch you again. I promise you that." Amara stared at his hand for what felt like an eternity, trying to understand if this was real or another trick, another betrayal dressed up as rescue. But his eyes were different from Chief Okonkwo's eyes, different from every man who had ever looked at her in this village. There was no hunger in them, no sense of ownership, only a deep, abiding fury at what had been done to her, and a determination to make it right. She took his hand. Chief Okonkwo arrived then, blustering and threatening, invoking tradition and arrangements and debt contracts, his voice rising in pitch as he realized his carefully constructed trap was disintegrating. Chibueze turned to him slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cold precision that comes from having actual power rather than the appearance of it. "I have recordings of everything, the drugging, the debt trap, the coercion. I've already sent copies to 3 journalists and a federal prosecutor who, unlike the local police, you don't own. If you say one more word, if you come near this girl ever again, I will make sure your name becomes synonymous with predator for the next 100 years. Do you understand me?" Chief Okonkwo's face went through several colors, red, purple, gray, before settling on the pale shade of defeat. The next 2 weeks existed in a strange suspended reality for Amara, as if she had died in that locked room and woken up in an afterlife that looked suspiciously like a glass mansion on the outskirts of Umue's village. Chibueze's estate was all clean lines and natural light, the architectural opposite of Chief Okonkwo's oppressive luxury. Here, windows opened onto gardens, rooms flowed into each other without locked doors, and the air itself seemed easier to breathe. Obioma became her unexpected companion, teaching her that not all women were like Mama Nkechi, that female friendship could be a source of strength rather than competition or betrayal. They talked for hours about trauma, about survival, about the difference between being saved and saving yourself. He didn't save you, you know, Obioma said one afternoon as they sat in the garden. He just kicked open the door. You're the one who held that glass to your throat. You're the one who chose yourself over submission. Never forget that. Slowly, like a flower unfurling after a long winter, Amara began to return to herself. She started painting again, something she had abandoned when her mother died, believing that beauty was a luxury she could no longer afford. Now, with canvas and colors provided without question or expectation, she painted her nightmares and her dreams, her past and her possible futures. Chibueze watched her healing from a respectful distance, never demanding gratitude or acknowledgement, never making her feel like she owed him anything beyond her own recovery. But sometimes their eyes would meet across a room, and something would pass between them, recognition, perhaps, of two people who understood what it meant to survive, and the heavy price survival often demanded. Justice, when it finally came, was not swift, but it was thorough. Mama Nkechi was arrested on charges of drugging and conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and the weight of her choices finally broke through her denial. In her jail cell she wept, not for Amara, not for the betrayal she had committed, but for herself, for the gambling addiction that had consumed her conscience, for the life she had wasted making terrible choices. The debt collectors took everything she had owned, leaving her with nothing but consequences. Chief Okonkwo's fall was more public and therefore more satisfying. In a village meeting that drew crowds from neighboring communities, his chieftaincy title was stripped away, with a ceremony that felt like public execution. His wives left him one by one, taking their children and whatever dignity he had left. His name became exactly what Chibueze had promised, a cautionary tale whispered in markets and compounds, a warning to other powerful men who believed money could buy anything, including innocence. But the most important moment came when Amara stood before the local council and told her story. Her voice shook at first, but with each word it grew stronger. And by the end, she was speaking not just for herself, but for every girl who had been sold, drugged, trapped, or silenced. 3 other young women came forward with similar stories about different men in different circumstances, but the same fundamental crime. Laws began to change, slowly, imperfectly, but they changed. Chibueze offered Amara a position managing an art therapy program for his foundation. Not charity, not pity, but recognition of her skills and her strength. She accepted, and 6 months later, she stood on a stage at a gala in Lagos, wearing an elegant gold dress, no longer the village girl who ground cassava at dawn, but a woman who had transformed her trauma into purpose. In the audience, Chibueze watched with an expression that Obioma recognized as something more than professional pride, something that looked like the beginning of love, built not on rescue, but on respect. The final chapter of this story, though perhaps it is better to say the beginning of a new chapter, takes place in a bright, sun-filled studio built on the outskirts of Umuwe's village, on land that once belonged to Chief Okonkwo and had been repurposed through legal battles and community pressure into a healing space for young women. Amara teaches painting here, guiding girls who carry their own scars and secrets to express what words cannot capture. Some days Chibueze visits, bringing art supplies and staying to help in ways that are practical rather than patronizing. Fixing a broken easel, organizing inventory, listening to the girls' stories with the kind of attention that tells them their lives matter. He and Amara walk together sometimes in comfortable silence, no longer stranger and rescued girl, but 2 people learning what it means to build something real from the broken pieces of their pasts. They have not spoken about love, not explicitly, but it exists between them like a language they are both learning to speak, slowly, carefully, without the rushing desperation of people who believe they need saving. The elders say that a tree does not grow strong in the shelter of another tree. It grows strong in the storm, and Amara is living proof of this wisdom. She did not need to be saved. She needed the world to finally step out of her way, to stop using tradition and debt and masculine authority as weapons against her autonomy. True power, the old women now whisper in the market, is not in taking what you want, but in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. And true love, it never demands, never coerces, never traps. It simply stands guard, offering hand instead of a cage, presence instead of possession. Wherever you are tonight, listening to this story, know that your nightmare is not your destiny. Your storm is not your story. And the person you become after surviving is more powerful than anything that tried to break you. Life always rewards the pure in heart, not immediately, not easily, but with a certainty that outlasts all the Chief Okonkwo's and Maman and Kechis of the world. And somewhere in that knowledge, in that promise, lies the only happy ending that truly matters. The one where you choose yourself, hold glass to the throat of your own destruction, and refuse to die for someone else's comfort. Remember that and pass it on.